In 1943, in the frozen hell of Krasnyy Yar, my platoon awaited annihilation from an overwhelming Russian assault. When the enemy advanced, something far worse emerged from the city's ruins. A spectral army of fallen soldiers, both German and Russian. They didn't want our lives, but our souls, choosing us as guardians of their untold stories. The battle for our outpost became a fight for our sanity, forever haunted by a duty that transcended war itself and the threshold of death. The winter of 1943 was merciless, but nothing compared to what we would face in the abandoned ruins of Krasnyy Yar. I was Sergeant Klaus Weber, a 24-year-old veteran of 3 brutal campaigns, leading a reinforced platoon of 32 men tasked with holding a strategic crossroads deep in enemy territory. Our orders were simple: maintain radio contact with headquarters and delay any Soviet advance through the sector for as long as possible. The town had been a minor industrial settlement before the war, population maybe 3,000. Now it was a graveyard of twisted metal and collapsed buildings, the skeletal remains of factories jutting from snow-covered rubble like broken bones. The temperature hadn't risen above -20 degrees Celsius in 2 weeks, and our breath formed ice crystals that fell like tiny shards of glass. My men were a mix of seasoned fighters and young recruits who'd barely seen their 18th birthdays. Corporal Muller, my second in command, had survived Stalingrad and carried the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. Private Schneider, barely old enough to shave, clutched his rifle with hands that shook from more than just the cold. They all looked to me for answers I didn't have. We'd established our defensive position in what remained of the town's administrative building, a 3-story concrete structure that offered excellent fields of fire down the main approach roads. The basement served as our command post and medical station, while machine gun nests covered the windows facing east toward the expected Soviet advance. The radio crackled with static most of the time, but when it worked, the news was grim. Army Group Center was in full retreat, and we were effectively cut off. No reinforcements were coming. No evacuation was planned. We were expendable pieces in a larger game, left to buy time with our lives. Sergeant Weber. Muller approached me on the second morning, his face grim beneath frost-covered eyebrows. The men are asking questions. They want to know how long we're supposed to hold this position. I stared out at the desolate landscape, where the wind howled through destroyed buildings like the wailing of lost souls. Until we receive orders to withdraw, Corporal. Or until there's no one left to give such orders. What I didn't tell him was that I'd already spotted Soviet reconnaissance teams probing our perimeter. Through my field glasses, I'd counted at least 2 companies of infantry moving into position in the ruins to our east. They were taking their time, setting up for a coordinated assault that would come with overwhelming force. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on the 3rd night, when Private Hoffman claimed he'd seen figures moving in the ruins during his watch. Not Russians. Something else entirely. Figures that seemed to glide rather than walk, leaving no tracks in the fresh snow. They looked like soldiers, he whispered to me in the dim light of our command post, his young face pale with fear. But they were. Wrong somehow. Like they were there but not there at the same time. I dismissed it as exhaustion and stress. We'd all been pushing ourselves to the limit, surviving on minimal sleep and frozen rations. Hallucinations weren't uncommon under such conditions. But deep down, something cold and unnatural had settled in my chest, a feeling that we were being watched by eyes that belonged to neither the living nor the entirely dead. The true horror would begin when the Russians finally launched their attack, and we discovered that some battles are fought on more than one plane of existence. The Soviet assault began at dawn on the 4th day, preceded by an artillery barrage that shook the very foundations of our makeshift fortress. Katyusha rockets screamed overhead like banshees, pulverizing what remained of the surrounding buildings into clouds of brick dust and twisted metal. I pressed myself against the concrete wall of our command post as chunks of debris rained down, the concussive force of each explosion threatening to collapse our lungs. "Contact front!" Muller's voice cut through the chaos as machine gun fire erupted from our defensive positions. Through the smoke and snow, I could see the first wave of Soviet infantry advancing across the open ground, their brown winter uniforms stark against the white landscape. They moved with the practiced efficiency of veteran troops, using cover and coordinated fire to suppress our positions. I grabbed the radio handset, desperately trying to raise headquarters. Static filled my ears, punctuated by occasional bursts of incomprehensible chatter from other units fighting their own desperate battles. We were truly on our own. "Schneider, get that Panzerfaust ready!" I shouted to the young private, who was fumbling with the anti-tank weapon, as Soviet armor appeared through the ruins. A T-34 tank rumbled forward, its main gun swiveling toward our building. The first shell punched through our eastern wall, sending a shower of concrete fragments across the room. For 3 hours, we held them back. My men fought with the desperation of cornered animals, knowing that surrender meant a bullet or a slow death in a Siberian labor camp. The Russians came in waves, each assault more determined than the last, and each time we managed to drive them back with devastating casualties on both sides. It was during a brief lull in the fighting that things took a turn toward the supernatural. Muller had just reported that we were down to less than half our ammunition when Private Hoffman came stumbling down from the upper floor, his face white as the snow outside. "Sergeant," he gasped, pointing toward the stairwell. "There's someone up there, someone who shouldn't be there." I followed him up to the second floor, my Schmeisser submachine gun at the ready. The corridor was filled with smoke and dust from the bombardment, but as we moved toward the eastern windows, I saw him. A figure in a German uniform stood motionless by the shattered glass, staring out at the battlefield below. He was translucent, like morning mist, and I could see the devastated cityscape through his body. "Who are you?" I demanded, raising my weapon, though some instinct told me bullets would be useless against this apparition. The figure turned slowly, and I found myself looking into the face of Obergefreiter Hans Richter, a soldier from the 24th Panzer Division who had died in this very building during the initial German assault on Krasnyy Yar 8 months earlier. I knew this because I had been there, had watched him bleed out from shrapnel wounds while we waited for medics who never came. "You should not be here, Klaus," he said, his voice carrying the hollow echo of wind through empty buildings. "This place, it holds onto those who die within its boundaries. The earth here is soaked with so much blood that it has become a gateway." Before I could respond, more figures began materializing throughout the room. German soldiers, Russian infantry, even what appeared to be civilian refugees, all bearing the wounds that had killed them, all staring at me with eyes that held impossible depth and sorrow. "What do you want?" I whispered, my rational mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. "To be remembered," Richter replied. "To have our stories told. The living fight and die and are forgotten, but we remain, trapped between worlds, carrying the weight of every moment, every decision, every final breath." A Soviet shell exploded nearby, and the spectral figures flickered like candle flames in a strong wind. When they solidified again, there were more of them, dozens filling the corridor, spilling down the stairwell into our defensive positions below. "Your battle will end soon," Richter continued, his form becoming more solid, more real. "But ours is eternal. We have chosen you, Klaus Weber, and your men to carry our burden, to become the guardians of our untold stories." I stumbled backward, bumping into Hoffman, who was staring at the ghosts with a mixture of terror and fascination. "This isn't real," I muttered. "Combat fatigue, shell shock, hallucinations." "Look outside," Richter commanded. I moved to the window and peered through the smoke at the battlefield below. What I saw defied every law of nature and warfare I had ever known. Among the advancing Soviet troops moved other figures, spectral soldiers in the uniforms of the Red Army, their ghostly forms weaving between their living comrades like wolves among sheep, and they were all converging on our building. The radio in my hand crackled to life with Muller's panicked voice. "Sergeant, something's happening down here. The temperature just dropped 20 degrees and the men are seeing things. Impossible things." I keyed the microphone with shaking fingers. "Hold your positions, Corporal. Whatever you see, whatever you think you see, maintain discipline and keep fighting." But even as I gave the order, I knew that our battle had expanded beyond the realm of conventional warfare. We were no longer just fighting for strategic territory or national ideology. We had become unwilling participants in a supernatural conflict that transcended the boundaries between life and death, between memory and oblivion. The real horror was just beginning, and I realized with growing dread that victory or defeat in this battle would be measured not in ground gained or lost, but in the price our very souls would pay for survival. The breaking point came when the spectral armies of both sides converged on our position simultaneously with the living forces. What followed challenged every understanding I had of reality, warfare, and the boundaries between life and death. The Soviet assault resumed with renewed fury, but now their advance was accompanied by ghostly figures that moved with impossible coordination. Dead Russian soldiers from previous battles walked alongside their living comrades, pointing out our defensive positions, guiding mortar fire with supernatural precision. I watched in horror as a spectral commissar gestured toward our machine gun nest, and seconds later, a perfectly placed artillery shell silenced our heavy weapon. "They're using the dead as reconnaissance," I breathed into the radio. "The Russians have ghosts helping them." Muller's voice crackled back, strained with disbelief and terror. "Sergeant, it's not just them. Our own dead are here too. I've got Wehrmacht ghosts telling me where to position the remaining men. Obergefreiter Richter just walked through the wall and gave me tactical advice." I rushed down to the first floor, where chaos had taken on an entirely new dimension. My surviving soldiers were fighting a conventional battle, while simultaneously receiving guidance from spectral comrades who had fallen in previous engagements. Private Schneider was taking aim instructions from the ghost of Sergeant Wolf, who had died defending this same position months earlier. The dead were teaching the living how to survive. But the supernatural intervention came at a terrible price. Each interaction with the spectral forces drained something vital from my men. Their faces grew gaunt, their movements slower, as if the ghosts were drawing life force to maintain their manifestation in our world. Schneider's hair had turned partially gray, and his hands trembled not from cold, but from some deeper exhaustion that seemed to penetrate his very soul. "Klaus," Richter's voice whispered beside me, though I couldn't see him in the smoke-filled room. "The boundary weakens with each death. Soon, the barrier between our world and yours will collapse entirely. Your men will become anchors, keeping us tethered to this realm of endless battle." "What are you saying?" I demanded, ducking as another Soviet shell punched through our defenses. "We need guardians," the ghost replied, his voice growing stronger, more commanding. "Living souls to carry our memories, our stories, our unfinished business. In exchange, we offer you the knowledge of every battle fought here, every tactic employed, every weakness in your enemy's strategy." Through the windows, I could see the impossible sight of living and dead soldiers fighting side by side on both sides of the conflict. Soviet specters guided anti-tank teams to our weak points, while German ghosts whispered defensive strategies to my overwhelmed troops. The battlefield had become a surreal theater where the deceased were more active participants than some of the living. The moment of ultimate crisis arrived when a massive Soviet T-34 tank, guided by ghostly spotters, lined up a direct shot at our command post. In that instant, as I watched the tank's main gun traverse toward us, Obergefreiter Richter materialized fully in front of me, solid, real, his uniform pristine despite the mortal wounds that had killed him months ago. "Accept the burden, Klaus," he said, his eyes blazing with otherworldly intensity. "Become our chronicler, our voice in the world of the living. Let us anchor ourselves to your soul and the souls of your men. In return, we will ensure you survive this battle and every battle that follows." The tank fired. Time seemed to slow as the shells screamed toward our position. I had perhaps 2 seconds to make a decision that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of every man under my command, and potentially countless souls trapped between life and death. "What's the price?" I shouted over the approaching projectile. "You will never truly be alive again," Richter replied calmly. "You will carry us with you always, hearing our voices, seeing our faces, feeling the weight of our unfinished stories. You will become a bridge between worlds, forever changed, forever haunted. But you will live, and through you, we will finally have peace." The shell was meters away. My men were looking at me with desperate hope, trusting their sergeant to somehow find a way out of an impossible situation. I thought of Schneider's young face, of Mueller's loyalty, of the 23 other soldiers who had followed me into this frozen hell. In that crystalline moment of decision, with death rushing toward us at terminal velocity, I made the choice that would alter the fundamental nature of my existence and bind my soul to forces beyond human understanding. "I accept," I screamed. The shells struck our building with devastating force. But instead of obliterating us, something extraordinary happened. The spectral soldiers surrounding us suddenly became a protective barrier, their ghostly forms absorbing and deflecting the explosive energy. The building shook, walls cracked, but we survived what should have been instant annihilation. But as the smoke cleared and I struggled to my feet, I felt them. Dozens of voices, memories, and consciousness flooding into my mind. The dead had found their guardians, and we were no longer entirely among the living. The weight of their stories, their unresolved conflicts, their desperate need to be remembered, settled into my soul like lead. I looked at my men and saw the same transformation occurring in their eyes. We had become something new, something caught between life and death, forever marked by our covenant with the spectral armies of Krasnyy Yar. The real battle was just beginning, and victory would require us to master powers we never knew existed. With the spectral covenant sealed, my transformed platoon became something unprecedented in the annals of warfare. Living soldiers guided by the tactical knowledge of every battle ever fought in Krasnyy Yar. The voices of the dead whispered strategies, revealed enemy positions, and provided intelligence that no conventional reconnaissance could match. "Muller, take 3rd Squad and flank left through the rubble field," I commanded, but the words weren't entirely my own. Obergefreiter Richter's tactical expertise flowed through me like water through a broken dam. "The Soviets have positioned a sniper in the church bell tower. Eliminate him with coordinated fire from buildings 7 and 12. My corporal's eyes reflected the same otherworldly knowledge that now burned within my own consciousness. He nodded grimly and moved out with mechanical precision, guided by the ghosts of German assault specialists who had died mastering urban combat in these very streets months earlier. The transformation in my men was remarkable and terrifying. Schneider, who had been fumbling with his rifle just hours before, now moved with the fluid grace of a veteran marksman. The spirit of Hauptfeldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, a decorated sniper, had merged with the young private's consciousness, lending him skills that would have taken years to develop naturally. "Sergeant!" Schneider called out, his voice carrying an unnatural confidence. "I can see their entire battle plan. The ghosts of their fallen are showing me where they'll concentrate their next assault." Through the haze of supernatural awareness, I perceived the Soviet strategy as clearly as if I were reading their commander's field notes. A pincer movement designed to crush us between converging forces, supported by armor and preceded by concentrated artillery. Conventional tactics would have meant certain death, but we were no longer bound by conventional limitations. "All units, fall back to secondary positions," I ordered, my voice carrying the authority of every fallen officer who had ever commanded in these ruins. "Prepare for the Geisterschlacht, the ghost battle." What followed defied every principle of military engagement I had learned in my years of service. As the Soviet forces launched their coordinated assault, we fought them with weapons both physical and supernatural. Our bullets found their marks with preternatural accuracy, guided by spectral spotters who could perceive targets through smoke, darkness, and solid matter. But the most devastating aspect of our new capabilities wasn't enhanced marksmanship. It was our ability to demoralize the enemy through psychological warfare that transcended the physical realm. The ghosts of fallen Soviet soldiers began appearing to their living comrades, not as allies, but as harbingers of their fate. Comrade Volkov, the specter of a dead Russian lieutenant, materialized before a Soviet machine gun crew, his uniform torn and blood-stained from the wounds that had killed him. "You remember me from the Stalingrad offensive. I died in these same ruins, cut down by German fire while following orders that made no tactical sense. Look around you. How many more must die for a worthless pile of rubble?" The effect was immediate and catastrophic for Soviet morale. Living soldiers found themselves face to face with comrades who had fallen in previous battles, being told in explicit detail how their own deaths would unfold if they continued the assault. Some broke and ran, others froze in terror, and a few opened fire on apparitions that bullets couldn't harm. The Soviet commander, Colonel Dmitry Petrov, attempted to rally his forces through the radio net, but his transmissions were being interrupted by ghostly voices, speaking in perfect Russian. describing his tactical errors and predicting his defeat with chilling accuracy. "Your left flank is exposed, Comrade Colonel," the spirit of a dead Soviet major whispered through the static. "The Germans know you've concentrated your reserves behind the tractor factory. They're moving to exploit the gap in your defensive line right now." As if summoned by the ghost's words, my transformed soldiers struck at precisely the predicted moment. Muller's squad materialized from the ruins like phantoms themselves, their suppressed weapons cutting down Soviet infantry who couldn't understand how their positions had been so perfectly compromised. The T-34 tank that had nearly destroyed us earlier became our next target. Private Hoffman, guided by the spirit of a Panzer ace, approached the armored vehicle with an anti-tank mine that should have been impossible to deploy undetected. But the ghosts created a corridor of misdirection, causing the Soviet infantry supporting the tank to look everywhere except where danger actually approached. The explosion that disabled the T-34 was followed by something even more unnerving: the tank crew's surrender to an enemy they couldn't see. Spectral German soldiers surrounded the damaged vehicle, their intimidating presence forcing the Soviet tankers to abandon their position without understanding why every instinct screamed at them to flee. But our supernatural advantages came with a terrible cost that became more apparent with each passing hour. The connection to the spirit realm was draining our life force at an alarming rate. Schneider's young face had aged years in a matter of hours. His hair now completely gray, his movements those of an old man despite his teenage body. "Sergeant," he approached me during a brief lull in the fighting, his eyes reflecting depths of experience that belonged to soldiers decades older. "I can feel them inside my head. All of them. Every German soldier who ever died here. Their memories, their pain, their unfinished business. It's overwhelming." I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the same supernatural burden weighing down my own consciousness. "We chose this path, Schneider. Now we must see it through to the end." The decisive moment arrived when Colonel Petrov, in desperation, ordered a final massive assault using his remaining reserves. Every Soviet soldier in the sector converged on our position simultaneously, determined to overwhelm us through sheer numbers regardless of casualties. But as they advanced across the snow-covered battlefield, something unprecedented occurred. The ghosts of every soldier who had ever died in Krasnyy Yar, German, Russian, and civilian, rose from the frozen earth as one. Not as allies or enemies, but as guardians of the living who had accepted their burden. The spectral army that emerged from the ruins numbered in the thousands, their ghostly forms creating a barrier between us and certain annihilation. For the first time since our covenant was sealed, I understood the true scope of what we had become. Not just soldiers, but custodians of every soul claimed by this cursed battlefield. The final confrontation would determine whether we could control our supernatural allies or be consumed by the very forces we had invoked to ensure our survival. The manifestation of thousands of spectral soldiers across the Krasny Yar battlefield created a phenomenon that transcended conventional warfare and entered the realm of supernatural apocalypse. As Colonel Petrov's final assault reached its crescendo, the very fabric of reality seemed to tear open, revealing the accumulated spiritual weight of every life lost in this cursed sector. The Soviet forces, already demoralized by their encounters with individual ghosts, now faced an entire phantom army rising from the snow-covered ruins. Tank crews abandoned their vehicles as spectral panzer crews materialized inside their machines, while infantry units broke formation when confronted by entire companies of dead comrades who spoke their names and described their impending deaths with horrifying precision. "This is impossible!" Colonel Petrov's voice crackled through captured radio transmissions, his composure finally cracking. "Central Command, I need immediate reinforcement. The Germans have. They have some kind of supernatural weapon. My men are reporting mass hallucinations, complete breakdown of unit cohesion." But what terrified me more than the enemy's reaction was what was happening to my own soldiers. The spiritual connection that had granted us tactical superiority was consuming us from within. Muller approached me with movements that belonged to a man 3 times his age, his face bearing the weight of centuries of military experience that no human mind was meant to contain. "Sergeant," he gasped, his voice a mixture of his own and those of the dozen dead officers whose knowledge he now carried. "I can see everything. Every battle fought here since the Mongol invasions. The voices, They're showing me patterns, cycles of violence that repeat across generations. This place is a nexus, a focal point where the barrier between life and death has been worn thin by endless bloodshed. Through the spectral overlay that now governed my perception, I witnessed the true scope of our situation. Krasnyy Yar wasn't just a strategic crossroads. It was a metaphysical junction where the accumulated trauma of warfare had created a permanent tear in reality. Every army that had ever passed through this region, from ancient tribal conflicts to the current mechanized slaughter, had left spiritual residue that had grown into something approaching sentience. The ghosts weren't random manifestations of the dead. They were components of a vast supernatural ecosystem that fed on violence and sustained itself through the memories of those who witnessed it. We hadn't just made a deal with individual spirits. We had become symbiotic hosts for an entity composed of collective military consciousness spanning centuries. "Schneider?" I called to the young private, who was now moving with the tactical precision of a master sergeant. "Status report on our ammunition and casualties." He turned toward me, and I was struck by the alien intelligence burning behind his teenage eyes. "We have unlimited ammunition, Sergeant," he replied in a voice that carried echoes of every quartermaster who had ever served in these ruins. "The dead provide whatever we need. But each bullet we fire, each tactical decision we make, binds us more completely to their realm." The implications of his words hit me like artillery fire. We weren't just borrowing the knowledge and resources of the spectral army. We were becoming part of it. Each supernatural advantage came at the cost of our humanity, transforming us into something that existed primarily in the realm of the dead, while maintaining only tenuous connections to the world of the living. The Soviet retreat began in earnest when their forward elements encountered manifestations that defied all military logic. Entire tank columns reported being attacked by phantom panzers that appeared and disappeared at will, while infantry units found themselves surrounded by ghostly Wehrmacht soldiers who spoke fluent Russian and knew intimate details about each man's life and family. "Comrade Lieutenant Volkov," a spectral German officer addressed a terrified Soviet platoon leader in perfect Russian. "Your wife Katerina received word of your death 3 weeks ago. She's remarrying your brother Pavel next month. Perhaps you should go home and surprise them both." The psychological warfare conducted by our ghostly allies was more devastating than any conventional weapon. Soviet soldiers who had endured the horrors of Stalingrad broke down completely when confronted with supernatural forces that knew their deepest fears and most personal secrets. But the retreat of the living forces only intensified the supernatural activity around our position. With fewer minds anchored to physical reality, the spectral realm began to assert greater dominance over the battlefield. Buildings that had been reduced to rubble months earlier appeared fully intact in the ghostly overlay, populated by phantom civilians going about their daily routines as if the war had never touched their community. Sergeant Weber. Obergefreiter Richter materialized beside me, his form now so solid I could smell the tobacco on his ghostly uniform. "The boundary collapse is accelerating. Soon, this entire sector will exist primarily in our realm. Your men will need to choose, complete the transformation and join us permanently, or fight to maintain their connection to the living world." I looked at my soldiers, each one struggling with the same terrible choice. They had gained supernatural abilities that made them nearly invincible in conventional combat, but at the cost of their essential humanity. The weight of countless military memories was crushing their individual personalities, replacing their original thoughts and motivations with the accumulated experiences of the dead. Private Hoffman suddenly straightened, his youthful features hardening into the expression of a career officer. "Sergeant," he said in a voice that belonged to someone decades older, "I've been analyzing the tactical situation from both historical and supernatural perspectives. We've created a strategic advantage that could alter the entire course of the war, but maintaining it requires permanent integration with the spectral command structure." The radio crackled with desperate transmissions from Soviet forces throughout the sector, reporting encounters with ghost armies and requesting immediate evacuation. But more disturbing were the reports beginning to filter in from German units in adjacent sectors. Our supernatural awakening was spreading, creating a ripple effect that threatened to transform the entire Eastern Front into a battleground where the dead outnumbered the living. Central Command's response, when it finally came, revealed that we had become something far more significant than a single platoon holding a minor crossroads. We had accidentally triggered a supernatural arms race that both sides were now scrambling to understand and control. The true horror of our situation became clear when I realized that victory in our small tactical engagement might have doomed thousands of other soldiers to the same fate we had chosen: eternal guardianship of the restless dead in a war that would never truly end. The final transformation came not in the heat of battle, but in the eerie silence that followed the Soviet retreat. As the last enemy forces disappeared into the frozen wasteland beyond Krasnyy Yar, my platoon and I faced the ultimate consequence of our supernatural covenant. We had become permanent guardians of a battlefield that existed simultaneously in the world of the living and the realm of the dead. "Sergeant," Muller approached me 3 days after the fighting ended, his appearance now that of a man who had aged decades in mere hours. "Central Command is requesting a full report on our defensive action. They want to know how 32 soldiers held off an entire Soviet regiment." I stared at the radio handset, knowing that no conventional military report could capture the reality of what we had experienced. How could I explain that we had survived by forming an alliance with the accumulated spirits of every soldier who had ever died in this cursed place? That we had become living bridges between the world of the dead and the ongoing war? Tell them we employed unconventional tactics and exploited superior defensive positions, I finally replied. No mention of the other elements. But even as I spoke those words, I knew our secret couldn't remain hidden for long. The supernatural energies we had unleashed were spreading beyond Krasnyy Yar, creating ripple effects throughout the entire Eastern Front. Reports were filtering in from other sectors of similar, unexplained phenomena. Ghostly reinforcements appearing at critical moments, tactical intelligence obtained through impossible means, enemy forces fleeing from battles they should have won. The Wehrmacht, desperate for any advantage in their deteriorating position, had begun investigating these incidents with scientific rigor. Within weeks, teams of researchers arrived at our position, led by SS Oberfuhrer Heinrich Richter, a distant relative of the ghost who had first contacted me, and a man whose interest in the occult was matched only by his ambition for military advancement. "Sergeant Weber." Richter addressed me in the ruins of our command post, his cold eyes reflecting a hunger I recognized as dangerous. "Your unit's performance has attracted considerable attention at the highest levels. We believe you've stumbled upon something that could revolutionize modern warfare." What followed was a series of experiments that transformed our small defensive position into a research facility for supernatural military applications. Scientists, occultists, and military strategists descended upon Krasnyy Yar, all seeking to understand and weaponize the forces we had accidentally unleashed. My men became test subjects in studies that pushed the boundaries between life and death. Each day brought new attempts to replicate our transformation, to create other units capable of communicating with the spectral realm. Most failed catastrophically, resulting in soldiers who lost their sanity completely or disappeared entirely into the ghostly dimension. But some succeeded, and with each success, the supernatural influence spread further across the war-torn landscape of Eastern Europe. By the spring of 1944, entire ghost battalions were fighting alongside living troops, their spectral presence tipping the balance in crucial engagements that conventional forces couldn't win. The war had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a conflict where the dead were as active as the living, where tactical advantages depended on spiritual alliances rather than material resources. The Holocaust took on new dimensions as the accumulated suffering of millions created supernatural phenomena that defied all attempts at scientific explanation. As for my original platoon, we became the core of a new military unit designated Abteilung Geist, the Ghost Department. Our official mission was reconnaissance and special operations, but our true purpose was to serve as intermediaries between the military command and the growing army of spectral allies that now influenced every major engagement on the Eastern Front. Private Schneider, aged beyond his years by supernatural exposure, became our primary medium, capable of communicating directly with the highest-ranking ghost officers who commanded vast legions of dead soldiers. His teenage body housed the collective knowledge of centuries of military experience, making him simultaneously the youngest and oldest tactical advisor in the Wehrmacht. "Sergeant," he approached me one winter evening in 1945, as the war entered its final, most desperate phase. "The spirits are showing me visions of how this conflict ends. The living armies will lay down their weapons, but our war, the war between different realms of existence will continue indefinitely. He was right. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, conventional hostilities ceased, but the supernatural forces we had awakened remained active. The Cold War that followed was as much a struggle between competing spiritual ideologies as political ones, with both sides employing ghost armies and spectral intelligence networks that operated beyond the reach of traditional espionage. My men and I survived the transition to peacetime, but we were no longer truly alive in any conventional sense. We existed in a liminal state between life and death, aging slowly, sustained by our connection to the supernatural realm we had helped create. We became chroniclers of the hidden war that continued to rage in the shadows of official history. Today, more than 70 years after that frozen hell in Krasnyy Yar, I remain bound to my supernatural duty. The voices of the dead still whisper in my mind, sharing their stories, their unfinished business, their desperate need to be remembered. I have watched the world transform, witnessed the rise and fall of nations, observed the evolution of warfare from conventional armies to cyber conflicts and beyond. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Some battles transcend the boundaries between life and death, creating legacies that bind the living to responsibilities they never chose to accept. My platoon became guardians of that supernatural battlefield, and our descendants in the intelligence services of various nations continue to manage the ongoing conflict between realms that most people never know exists. The ghosts of Krasnyy Yar taught us that victory and defeat are meaningless concepts when measured against the eternal struggle to preserve the memories of those who sacrificed everything for causes they believed in. We learned that some duties transcend death itself, and that the price of survival can be the loss of everything that makes us human. Yet in accepting that burden, we also discovered a form of immortality that allows the stories of the fallen to live on through those who remember them. Perhaps that is the true victory. Not the tactical success of any single engagement, but the preservation of honor and memory across the vast battlefield of time itself.